all X is Z. How complex and hard it is to get data. I've been seeing a rise of Twitter posting and videos or comments on videos that are talking about the situation of police brutality, police overreact, and violence. And certainly it is of concern. And using this particular subject, I wanted to use logic and reason upon it, not just for this particular situation, but for every situation, any situation that we observe to be the case. We have to use rational thinking to temper our emotions, else we will be making statements that are just as invalid as statements made by, say, somebody that believes in a religion might make, and as a skeptic or atheist or agnostic or whatever that many of you that follow me are, we recognize easily when somebody says something that we consider nonsense in reference to a belief that they hold that's directly tied to a God concept. But it's much harder when it's an event that's going on, especially if it's going on right outside your door, for example. It's harder to be logical, especially in that moment, because there's a lot of emotion going on. You see it and go, oh man, this is terrible. And it is terrible. But you have to then buckle down and apply even more logic and rationality to it. And you might have to recover from your emotions a bit, granted. So, X is Z. You've seen an example where this is true. So, this could be, I have seen police being brutal and applying force in a way that is not good in this situation. And that's correct. Nobody can refute that. It's been documented. It's been recorded. So you saw that once. So there you go. There's one instance that you've seen it on the data chart that you're beginning. You don't know how many there are out there. You know there's at least one. Okay, so you could look up and see if there's another incident that shares that same sort of event. And during this time, you'll see media out there that is covering different protests and instance of police utilizing force in a way that they shouldn't. So now you've got a couple examples. All right. So you want as many examples as you can that this happens, right? Because the more data that you have, the better your data is going to be. But you still have to take the larger picture into consideration. This particular situation is in a microcosm of other situations going on, and that might need to factor into your data set. Is it that every time, and there's that word you have to be careful of, because it's a universal, the word every is a claim that this happens everywhere, all the time, every instance, every point on this bell curve should be filled with examples of this if the word every is being used. So rather than use a superlative, we want to be precise in our articulation of events. Saying many can also be a problem because, well, what do you mean by many? Then it should be more than what? 2, 3, 4? How many is many? Well, it's kind of a subjective term, before you get to the point of many. You know, you have to have a certain amount, and so maybe that's not a very good term. Okay, so a high percentage of this occurs. So now, to get any percentages, we'd have to measure over a given time the amount that is being done. Now, what we have going on in this particular crisis of madness is a number of different various protests and some things that I wouldn't consider protests, but rather riots, or things that one could perceive as a riot or a protest, depending on how you look at it. If you're causing destruction, I think that's a riot. If you're simply protesting, you know, then you're just saying things, and you might be a little bit loud, but you're otherwise peaceful. You're not causing destruction. Okay, fine. But we still need to find out the numbers. So, you know, whatever that is, however many numbers of protests, however many that is in comparison to how many times the cops have been brutal in response to the people in the protests. Locations might need to be a factor. Also, what were the police told? Orders given? And all of these are factors that have to be considered because, well, if the group of people that the police are responding to is really, really big, then they might act differently than if the group is really small. Now, that doesn't and cannot justify their brutality, but it might be a factor to help us to understand why, in this situation, they're using excessive force, whereas in some other situation, we didn't see excessive force being used. So, unless we could show that every single time across the board, no matter how big the situation is, that police were using brutality, we couldn't make a statement like all police are being brutal every single time. We could say in certain times, in certain situations, they're being, they're using excessive force. Certainly that's the case. But without this data spread, without the collection of that data, then what statement ought we be making about the situations that we see unfold, whether it's you saw it personally or you're just aware of it because it's on the news all the time? Well, because we want to ideally be precise in our language, and what you say is going to be read by other people. And so, as a good vessel of information, you ideally, I think, want to provide information in a way that others will absorb. And so, yes, you can react emotionally to the event. What's going on is wrong versus this is happening all the time or everywhere. These are two different statements. Both contain emotions, but this statement, the latter statement, is one that you don't have data for. Or if you do have the data, then all you have to do is post the data and say, look at this. Here's what's going on. This is, this is how many times we've documented this and how many times, this has gone wrong. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because what you say is going to be read and or heard, depending on how you convey it. Maybe you put it on Twitter, so it's going to be read. Maybe you voiced it in a video, so it's going to be heard. And so when you say all X is Z, you need to be able to demonstrably demonstrate that this is actually the case. Maybe it's the case that sometimes X is Z, or in this current situation, X is Z more often than we've seen in other situations. And of course, when I see people contrast two different situations, look, over here we had event, uh, we had event Y, and in that event, this happened, B happened, but here in this event of X, we see Z happening. And in this particular case, we had a number of, whatever color people behaving in whatever way, and then the response was in this way, but yet over here we have a different response, and so therefore it's racist, and we can see that it's racist, yada, yada, yada. Well, no, because there's a lot going on that's different about these two different events. And all of those things have numerous factors that have to be considered before we could declare this to be anything. And so this sort of reasoning takes time, effort, and energy. It's difficult to get this sort of data. It's difficult to collect all of this data or to find sources that have already collected this data. It's not easy. You can't just go to Google and type it in, because you have to actually find people that have bothered to do polling and, to look at or get data from police departments and whatever. And usually that data is going to be from the past. It's not going to be data that's from today. And we want to act upon today's data, right? Well, we can't, because we can't make a coherent data set, especially one based on things that we personally have observed. That's not going to be a big enough number to make a decent data set. But I want to comment on the situation at hand. Understandable. I do too. I don't like the situations that are going on. Okay, so we're seeing a rise in, say, police brutality. That's what's going on. Is it happening every case? No, it's happening in certain cases. Is it wrong? Absolutely, it's wrong. But the way to solve it is not to pour more wrong upon it. The way to address it is a different way. Well, how do we address it then? That's the question, maybe. And rather than trying to say it's racist or whatever, which it might be, but we don't know that because we don't have the data to show that yet. I'm not even sure what that would look like, honestly. What is it to be racist? Is it that all this group of people that are this thing are being treated in such a way, are being treated in a certain way, and therefore that's racist, or that's, bad? It's like, well, are they being all treated in this way because of this? Or are they being treated this way because of something else? And how do we determine that? And it's a difficult question to answer. And maybe that's a distraction from the problem itself, which is the bigger problem. The bigger problem might have nothing to do with what color skin people are, but with the fact that there's events going on that an authority figure have to do something about, and what they're doing is disproportionately incorrect. They should be doing it in a different way, and they're not doing it in that different way. But there's still the fact that this group is performing in this way. So it's very difficult to control a large group of people. In fact, perhaps, and this is, of course, militaries spend a lot of training to get everybody in the same mind sync so that you have the group performing in a certain way. You don't have that sort of training for civilians, so to speak. You don't have a crowd of people behave in a guided way unless you have a particular leader of that group, showing them how to behave or guiding them on their path. And so without that, you simply have the group acting as its own sort of agent, if you will, doing whatever. And that's more like a reactionary entity than it is an intelligent entity. I see this as, the phrase of, a person is smart, but people are dumb. A single person here might be otherwise very intelligent and an upstanding citizen, but together they make this thing that's kind of dumb. And it's kind of dumb in the same way that you might see, some lesser form or lower form, if you will, of life perform. That's like, well, this ant, okay, sure, it can find a path, but it's kind of dumb because it doesn't know that I'm going to smash it if it goes across my fingers one more time. So that ant is behaving in ways that are a pattern that it has to do, but it is not necessarily behaving in ways that an individual would do. If it's working in a group, it behaves differently than it does as an individual. Although ants are special in that they act for the collective good, in a sense. I think the behavior pattern of many people is going to be very different than the behavior pattern of many people led by one person, but it doesn't matter if I think that. I'd have to show that that's the case, right? Okay, so we do have two parties going on. We have the protest, and we have the riots, and then we have good actors, we have bad actors, and then you have the police, or you have the authority. You have those in charge, and they all have to respond to these things. So if we're seeing a rise in these people being bad, is it because these people are being bad? Maybe. But what can we do? Well, one thing that could be done is simply stop protesting for a while. Now, I know that seems maybe unfathomable, but what if for a while people stopped protesting, right? No more protest, no more police brutality, right? Then we could sit down at a table, so to speak, with the people in charge and say, okay, we got your attention, and now let's sit down and talk about this problem together so that we can figure out how to solve it. And we understand negotiations, so we also understand that neither of us is going to be completely satisfied with the outcome, but it's going to be one that we can both live with. And right now, if you keep repeating the same action, you're going to see the same result. And in fact, you might see worse and worse. Like, okay, well, they're throwing more force at us every time we protest. So we're going to protest more. Okay, well, what's going to happen? Are they going to stop throwing more force at us? No, they're going to throw even more force at us. So then we need to protest even more. We need to protest even stronger because, but then, of course, there is a fear, understandably. People say, well, but if we stop now, then we're saying that it's okay, that all they have to do to make us stop is put enough force upon us, and that will quell us. No. They're ready to talk. They want to talk. They'd rather talk than have force. They don't want to do the force. They want peace. If it is proven that you've done all that you can peacefully and nothing has changed, then the sort of insanity of protest, riots, etc., whatever, might make sense at that point. I don't think that it's been proven that we have exhausted all peaceful options yet. I don't even know if we've attempted peaceful options. And people might say, oh, we tried this and it didn't work. Or, well, it was tried over here. There was that person that was kneeling that one time and everyone laughed at them. Well, maybe they laughed at that because that is not a protest. Maybe that's not really a good way to say no to it. Maybe instead they could have protested in a way that actually made sense. Say, hey, look, here's all this money that I get, and I'm going to use it to influence, the bigwigs, and by doing that, I'll actually make a difference. And you could do that visibly. Or maybe you could do it invisibly. It doesn't matter. You get the same result, so what's it matter how it's done? Well, it's easier to kneel down than it is to do this, certainly. And it's less expensive, by the way, as well. Now, this isn't about the protests altogether. It's not meant to be about just that particular event, or events, if you will. What this is meant to be is simply a call to reason and logic, which is part of what I do here, is try to apply logic to arguments that are bad and try to point out when those arguments are bad and in what way. We want to gather data on the situation, but all we can do is gather a few dots of data at best. That's not going to be a significant amount to show us all of the data points at all ends of the Bell spectrum here. Gathering that much data is really hard. I'm not saying that a single individual cannot do it, because certainly you could, but that takes a lot of effort and cannot be condensed into, I think, a few characters that are allowed on Twitter. It's going to have to be a long form, whether it's a blog or a video or something. It's going to take longer than a few words to express it. So if we can all recognize that our emotions might unduly influence us to say, look at this, oh, it's so terrible, this whole thing, it's happening everywhere, it's happening all the time, everyone's being this way, and all the things are awful, and oh man, it's the end of the world, and we need to do this, and we have to do something before it's too late. End of the world. Well, wait a minute. That might be a little bit hyperbolic. I get it. I'm jaded. But maybe we need to go, well, this sucks. What can I do about it? And maybe you can't do much of anything. But there is something you can do. Rather than adding fuel to the fire, you can instead take on the personal responsibility of not adding to the problem, but instead recognizing that you, as well as I, are human, and that we are going to make more out of an event than maybe we ought. As many of you know, to take a personal example, even though that shouldn't be worth much of anything, it's a single data point. It's not much of anything, but still it's going to have an emotional impact, perhaps. So in that sense, it might be worthwhile to talk about. A number of days ago, there was 2 murders that occurred right in my area, right outside my front door. The first murder occurred. That made me very scared and upset, and I'm still upset about it. I'm still thinking about it. A man got shot in the head. He's dead. That's not good. And I think about why? How? What do I, there's nothing I can do to undo that. There's nothing the person got arrested that did it. Okay, great. But is there anything I could have done? Well, the things I did try to do was to warn those in authority that weird things were going on. And they recognized that, but they didn't act on it soon enough. And maybe because they didn't act on it soon enough, those people are now gone. If they'd acted sooner, those people might still be around, or at least been around so that they could have been removed in a different way that's not death. So perhaps the authorities that are in charge are in the same sort of position. They recognize that if they let this go on, that people might die or get hurt. And so they know that they need to do something, that they need to act, or people might die. Now, their actions might be an overreaction, and we see that and we don't like that. But we would also see their non-action, and we'd really not like that. So rather than responding to it with even more things that might make them have this feedback loop, we need to then break the cycle. And if we personally aren't doing the things, all we are is seeing the things and reporting on the things or talking about these things, then rather than add to the irrationality, perhaps we need to be even more rational than before. And so I hope that I start to see more tweets and more videos that call for rationality and reason to reign supreme instead of emotions and feelings. And so if you're a friend or an acquaintance of mine or whatever you want your label to be, and you see me post on Twitter, prove it, or what's your data for that, or something like it, then you'll, I hope, note that I'm doing that to try to get you to be more rational about your claim, and that your claim needs to be as demonstrably demonstrated as the claims of others that we've examined in the past, so that our future might be a good one. Thank you for listening. Take care.